In the depths of the oldest traditions, long before the emergence of the Abrahamic religions as we know them today, there existed a world filled with mysteries and invisible forces. This world was inhabited by spirits, angels, and demons, but the way they were seen and understood by the ancient Israelites was quite different from what we find in modern theology. Instead of a moral war between good and evil, the Israelites viewed the universe as a battlefield between chaos and order, a primordial struggle reflected in both the forces of nature and the legends and rituals of their people. However, as we delve into these ancient beliefs, we encounter a series of enigmatic figures and occult practices that challenge our current conceptions. Who were these mysterious entities that inhabited the desert? And why were certain spiritual practices seen as dangerous and forbidden? Could these prohibitions have hidden deep knowledge about the workings of the universe and the power of magic? In modern religious narratives, we are accustomed to imagining a constant battle between good and evil, where angelic forces fight against demonic hordes. However, for the ancient Israelites, this duality did not exist in the same way. The true battle they witnessed in their mythologies was between chaos and order. This struggle was not moral but cosmic, reflecting the unpredictable nature of the world and the need for a divine power to establish balance. The figure of Leviathan, mentioned in the texts of the Book of Job and the Psalms, is one of the most iconic representations of this primordial chaos. Leviathan was seen as a gigantic and terrifying creature, a symbol of chaos emerging from the depths of the sea. Yahweh, the supreme God of the Israelites, is often described as dominating and subjugating this sea monster, imposing his order over the turbulent waters. But what does this image really mean? Why was it so important for the Israelites to depict their God as a conqueror of chaotic forces? Unlike Egyptian and Mesopotamian mythologies, where demons like Pazuzu and Lamashtu had well-defined roles and were integrated into popular beliefs, the Israelite tradition was characterized by the absence of a clear pantheon of demons. This does not mean that chaos was absent from their stories, but rather that the focus was on the struggle between Yahweh and these primordial forces threatening the stability of the cosmos. Yahweh was thus seen not only as the creator but as the maintainer of cosmic order, a warrior god who faced chaos at every moment. This conception of order versus chaos is also reflected in the laws and rituals of the Israelites, where every act of purification and sacrifice aimed to ward off chaotic influences and restore harmony. But what does this tell us about the mindset of these people? They viewed the world as an unstable place, always on the brink of being consumed by chaos, and believed that only through the strict observance of Yahweh's commandments could divine order be maintained. However, this worldview began to change over time, especially during the Babylonian exile. As they came into contact with cultures like the Persian and Hellenistic, the Israelites began to absorb new ideas and symbols. It was at this point that the concept of a moral war between good and evil started to emerge, influenced by the Persian duality of Ahura Mazda and Engra Mainyu. But was this new paradigm merely a cultural adaptation, or did it reflect a genuine shift in the spiritual perception of the Israelites? If we look at the oldest texts, we see that the cosmic conflict was less about angels and demons fighting for human souls and more about Yahweh's continuous effort to subdue the uncontrollable forces of nature. Chaos was not personified as a specific demonic entity, but rather as a state of disorder that needed to be constantly battled. This suggests that the Israelites had a more pragmatic and less moralistic view of the universe. Leviathan, as a symbol of chaos, is repeatedly defeated in the scriptures but never completely destroyed. This is significant because it shows that chaos was seen as an eternal force that could never be eliminated, only controlled. Thus, the fight against Leviathan is a metaphor for the daily struggle the Israelites believed they needed to engage in to maintain order in their lives and society. Over time, this cosmic battle was reinterpreted by prophets and apocalyptic writers, who began to see chaos as a force of evil, associating it with demons and evil spirits. This shift in perspective is crucial to understanding how religious thought evolved and how the modern ideas of angels and demons emerged. But was this transition merely a natural evolution, or were there external influences that shaped this new vision? If we examine apocalyptic texts like the Book of Daniel, we notice the introduction of figures such as the Archangel Michael, who fights against the forces of darkness in Yahweh's name. This heroic figure symbolizes the paradigm shift, where the battle moves from cosmic to moral. The struggle between order and chaos is reinterpreted as a war between good and evil, a narrative that would become central in later religions. But what happened to the ancient beliefs about chaos? Were they forgotten, or did they continue to exist in the esoteric and mystical traditions that would develop in the following centuries? This transition from a cosmic struggle to a moral battle reflects the cultural and political changes the Israelites faced. The ancient paradigm of order versus chaos was suppressed but never fully eradicated. The persistence of these ancient myths in later mystical traditions, such as in Kabbalah and apocryphal literature, suggests that there was an underground current of thought that continued to see chaos as an essential part of the universe. Even as Judaism, Christianity, and Islam consolidated their dualistic theologies, these old ideas still found a place on the fringes of religious thought. This cosmic battle between order and chaos, then, did not entirely disappear but was absorbed and reinterpreted by esoteric traditions. Could it be that these ancient myths still influence our modern beliefs about spiritual conflict? Perhaps by investigating the roots of these stories, we can rediscover a forgotten aspect of our own spirituality. When we explore the mythology of ancient Israel, we encounter entities that are mentioned only briefly, but whose presence suggests something dark and mysterious. Among these figures are the Shedim and the Serim, supernatural beings associated with the desert and desolate lands. But who were these entities? And why were they feared by a people already accustomed to the harshness of nature? The Serim, literally the hairy ones, are described as spirits inhabiting ruins and abandoned places. Some scholars believe these beings were originally minor gods or nature spirits from neighboring cultures, later demonized by the Israelites as they consolidated their monotheism. However, there is something deeply unsettling about the image of these spirits wandering through desolate lands. In Israelite mythology, the desert was seen as a place of trial, where the veil between the physical and spiritual worlds was thinner. But was the desert merely a geographic space, or did it also represent the darker side of the human psyche? The Shedim, on the other hand, are rarely mentioned in Hebrew scriptures but appear more frequently in later rabbinic literature. The term's origin seems to derive from the Akkadian word shidu, which referred to protective spirits in Mesopotamia. Interestingly, these protective spirits became demons in Israelite mythology, symbolizing the demonization of foreign deities. This raises the question: were the Israelites merely rejecting the gods of their neighbors, or was there a genuine fear of these entities and what they represented? In the context of the divine council, we encounter an even more enigmatic figure, Ha-Satan, the accuser. Unlike the popular image of Satan as a rebel against God, the original Ha-Satan was a sort of prosecutor, a figure who served in Yahweh's divine council to test the faith of humans. In the book of Job, we see this figure requesting permission from Yahweh to test Job's faith, subjecting him to terrible trials and suffering. But why would Yahweh allow such a thing? Was Ha-Satan fulfilling an essential role in the Israelite spiritual narrative, acting as a kind of quality control of human faith? In addition to Ha-Satan, there is also the Malach HaMashchit, the destroying angel, an entity that appears during moments of great calamity. He is described as the executor of divine wrath, responsible for bringing plagues and destruction, as seen in the famous plagues of Egypt. The image of this angel, wielding a sword and dealing death indiscriminately, is one of the most terrifying in the scriptures. This raises an unsettling question. Was this angel of destruction a demonic figure, or simply a manifestation of divine justice in its most brutal form? Interestingly, while other cultures, such as the Egyptian and Mesopotamian, had a wide range of demons and evil spirits, the ancient Israelites seemed to shy away from creating a demonic pantheon. Instead, destructive and chaotic forces were seen as being under Yahweh's direct command. Diseases, calamities, and plagues were not the work of independent demons but of messengers sent by God himself. What does this say about the Israelites' worldview? Perhaps they believed that nothing, not even chaos, existed outside the divine will. However, as apocalyptic thought began to gain strength, especially after the Babylonian exile, the figure of Ha-Satan and other members of the divine council began to change. They shifted from being servants of Yahweh to direct adversaries. This reflects a significant shift in Israelite theology, influenced by the dualistic ideas of Persian religions. But what motivated this transformation? Was it merely contact with other cultures, or an internal need to explain suffering and injustice in the world? Over time, Ha-Satan evolved into the figure of Satan, the absolute adversary of God, an image that would become central in Christianity and Islam. The destroying angel, in turn, transformed into the angel of death, Malach HaMavet, a being feared in various esoteric traditions. It is fascinating to observe how these figures, initially part of the divine justice system, were gradually separated from divinity and converted into personifications of evil. The demonization of these figures may have been a response to the growing need to create a moral narrative, where good and evil are clearly defined. However, on the fringes of mystical thought, echoes of ancient beliefs still linger. Kabbalah, for instance, preserves the idea that chaos is an intrinsic part of the universe, necessary for the existence of order. Could these ancient desert spirits and hostile members of the divine council be remnants of these archaic beliefs? As we investigate these figures and their transformations over time, we realize that they did not completely disappear but were absorbed and reinterpreted by esoteric and occult traditions. We might say that the desert, with its howling winds and mysterious spirits, still echoes the call of these forgotten entities, waiting for those who dare to listen. After all, who are these spirits that inhabit abandoned places and roam the shadows of history? Are they waiting to be rediscovered by modern occult practices, or will they forever remain a mystery in ancient sacred texts? In popular imagination, the ancient Israelites are often viewed as a deeply religious people with a strictly monotheistic faith. But when we dive into the scriptures and historical texts, we find traces of occult and magical practices that contrast with this conventional image. In the book of Exodus, for example, the explicit prohibition, "You shall not permit a sorceress to live," suggests that sorcery not only existed but was common enough to warrant severe prohibition. But what exactly did these sorceresses do? What kind of power did they possess that was considered so dangerous? The texts speak of practices such as divination, spirit invocation, and necromancy, activities that were seen as attempts to manipulate divine forces for personal gain. The famous story of the Witch of Endor is a clear example of these practices. King Saul, desperate for answers about his future, turns to this necromancer despite having banned divination in Israel. The ensuing scene is both intriguing and terrifying. The woman successfully conjures the spirit of the prophet Samuel, who rises from the underworld and foretells Saul's death. What does this reveal about the Israelite view of the afterlife and the power of necromancy? The Israelite underworld, known as Sheol, was seen as a dark, silent place where the spirits of the dead lingered in a state of semi-consciousness. However, the evocation of Samuel suggests that, under certain circumstances, the dead could be brought back to the world of the living, at least temporarily. This act of necromancy was not just a forbidden ritual. It was a violation of the natural order, a transgression that challenged divine authority. But was this practice condemned because it was effective, or simply because it had the potential to undermine the priest's control over the spiritual realm? Another fascinating example of magic in ancient Israel is the silver scrolls of Ketef Hinnom. Discovered in tombs, these scrolls contain protective inscriptions using the sacred name of Yahweh. The texts, similar to the priestly blessing found in the Book of Numbers, were used as amulets, a form of apotropaic magic intended to ward off evil spirits and protect the dead. This suggests that while sorcery was condemned, magical practices involving the divine name had a certain degree of acceptance. Could this be a form of sanctioned magic, an expression of divine power rather than a dangerous deviation? The use of amulets and talismans also extends to other objects in ancient Israel, such as the Urim and Thummim, two sacred stones used by priests to receive divine answers. These objects, essentially tools of divination, raise an important question. Why were some forms of magic allowed and even encouraged, while others were strictly forbidden? It seems the distinction lay in the source of power. If the magic was seen as an extension of divine will, it was acceptable. But if it appeared to be an attempt to manipulate the divine without permission, it was deemed heretical. Over time, as Judaism began to be influenced by Persian and Hellenistic cultures, attitudes toward magic became even more complex. In the apocalyptic period, texts like the Book of Enoch describe fallen angels teaching humans occult practices, such as weapon making and the creation of enchantments. These practices, transmitted by supernatural beings, were viewed as a transgression, a knowledge that mortals should not possess. But was this condemnation merely a matter of religious control, or was there a genuine fear of the power this knowledge could grant to its practitioners? The demonization of these practices may have been a way to reaffirm the authority of the priests and the scriptures. By condemning magic, religious leaders were essentially trying to centralize spiritual power and eliminate any competition. However, archaeological evidence and historical accounts suggest that many common Israelites continued to practice magic in secret, using amulets, protective rituals, and incantatory formulas passed down through generations. An intriguing example is the use of sacred herbs and incense in healing and purification rituals. The Book of Leviticus describes the use of anointing oils and specific incenses to consecrate objects and people, practices that have clear parallels with ritual magic. Substances like myrrh and incense were believed to ward off evil spirits and attract the divine presence. This raises a question. Where does religious ritual end and magic begin? Were these practices truly separate, or is the difference only in how they are interpreted through modern eyes? The complexity of Israelite magic is also reflected in later rabbinic literature, which develops a series of laws and rules about what is permitted and what is forbidden. In the Talmud, there are detailed discussions about the difference between a miracle, considered a manifestation of divine power, and sorcery, seen as a distortion of that power. But these distinctions are not always clear. In some cases, the very use of magical formulas invoking the name of Yahweh is allowed, as long as it serves a sacred purpose. This suggests a fine line between what is considered legitimate magic and illicit sorcery. Despite prohibitions and attempts at control, magic continued to flourish on the margins of Israelite society. Apocryphal texts and grimoires from the medieval period show a persistence of these practices, often disguised as religious rituals. Solomonic magic, for instance, is a system of invocations and enchantments based on texts attributed to King Solomon, one of the greatest magicians in Jewish esoteric tradition. This reveals that the magical tradition never completely disappeared. It merely changed form and context. We might then ask, was magic truly banned from ancient Israel, or did it continue to live on in occult practices and esoteric secrets carefully guarded and transmitted? Perhaps the true power of Israelite magic lies in its ability to adapt and survive, even in the face of religious and cultural opposition. And as we examine these ancient practices, could it be that we are rediscovering a hidden knowledge that may still hold relevance today? While alchemy is widely associated with Egyptian and Hermetic traditions, there are subtle indications that the ancient Israelites practiced a form of spiritual alchemy, focused not merely on the transformation of matter but on the purification of the soul and the strengthening of the connection with the divine. At the heart of this practice lies the concept of the raising of the serpent, a symbol that reappears across various texts and stories, from Moses' bronze serpent to mystical techniques developed in Kabbalah. But what does this serpent image signify, and why is it so powerful? The bronze serpent, mentioned in the Book of Numbers, is a fascinating example. When the Israelites were attacked by venomous snakes, Moses, under divine instruction, crafted a bronze serpent and lifted it on a pole. Those who looked upon it were healed from the bites. This ritual is often interpreted as a symbol of healing, but there is a deeper layer of meaning here. The act of raising the serpent represents the alchemical transmutation of poison, chaos, into healing order, a metaphor resonating with the Hermetic principle of solve et coagula, to dissolve and recompose. Could it be that Moses was applying ancient esoteric knowledge, passed down through generations? Spiritual alchemy in the Israelite context did not involve merely symbolic objects, but also the practice of mixing and consecrating sacred substances. The anointing oils, described in detail in the Book of Exodus, were made from specific blends of spices such as myrrh, calamus, and cinnamon. These ingredients were chosen not only for their physical properties, but for their spiritual and energetic associations. The process of consecrating these oils was a form of ritualistic alchemy, transforming common substances into vehicles of divine power. The use of sacred incense in rituals also reflects a form of spiritual alchemy. When burned, incense releases a fragrant smoke that rises to the heavens, symbolizing the elevation of the soul and the connection with the divine. The fragrance of the incense was seen as an offering pleasing to Yahweh, but also served to purify the environment and ward off evil spirits. The very act of burning incense is an alchemical process, where solid matter transforms into smoke and scent, a metaphor for spiritual transmutation. Could this be evidence that the ancient Israelites viewed alchemy as a spiritual practice, rather than merely a physical one? In Jewish mysticism, particularly in Kabbalah, we find the concept of tikkun olam, or the repair of the world. This idea aligns with the alchemical principle that the internal transformation of a person contributes to the healing and order of the cosmos. Kabbalists speak of the raising of the sparks, a practice aimed at recovering the divine sparks scattered throughout the world after the primordial fall. Could this be a form of spiritual alchemy, where the practitioner seeks to transform their own soul and, in doing so, elevate all of creation? Kabbalistic texts also discuss the use of sacred letters and divine names as instruments of spiritual transformation. The Tetragrammaton, YHWH, the sacred name of God, is considered an alchemical key that, when meditated upon and pronounced correctly, can transform consciousness and open portals to higher levels of existence. The esoteric use of Hebrew letters through techniques like gematria and tamura reveals a deep understanding of the hidden properties of language. But is this a form of linguistic magic or a practice of mental alchemy? The idea of transforming poison into healing also appears in the purification rituals described in Leviticus. Animal sacrifices, ritual washings, and the use of purifying water were examples of practices aimed at eliminating spiritual impurity and restoring order. Water, in particular, was seen as an alchemical solvent, capable of washing not only the body but also the soul. In purification rituals, the water was consecrated and transformed into a healing agent, a process reminiscent of the alchemical elixirs of later traditions. The relationship between spiritual alchemy and medicine is also noteworthy. In the biblical period, many diseases were seen as physical manifestations of spiritual impurity or internal imbalance. Treatments often involve the application of sacred oils, blessings, and prayers, practices similar to alchemical healing procedures. This suggests that the ancient Israelites did not see a separation between body and spirit, but rather an interconnectedness that could be manipulated through ritual practices. What is perhaps most fascinating is that many of these ideas survived throughout the centuries, evolving into more complex forms of mysticism and magic. The spiritual alchemy of the ancient Israelites left its mark on Kabbalah, Solomonic magic, and even on European esoteric practices. Medieval and Renaissance grimoires, for example, frequently reference anointing oils and sacred names, showing a continuity of this hidden knowledge. However, Israelite spiritual alchemy was more than just the manipulation of physical substances or external rituals. It was an internal practice, a quest for the transformation of the soul and union with the divine. In many respects, physical alchemy, with its pursuit of the philosopher's stone, is merely a metaphor for this inner quest for enlightenment and spiritual ascension. Thus, when we look at ancient texts and the ritual practices of the Israelites, we realize that they contain profound esoteric knowledge, a form of spiritual alchemy aimed not only at transforming the world around them but also at transforming themselves. Has this tradition been forgotten, or does it remain alive, hidden within the occult practices and mystical teachings of Kabbalah? And if this ancient knowledge is still accessible to those who dare to seek it, perhaps true alchemy lies within us, waiting to be rediscovered and put into practice. The prophets of ancient Israel are often regarded as sacred figures, messengers chosen by Yahweh to convey His will. However, when we examine the texts with a keen esoteric eye, we discover something fascinating. Many of the acts performed by these prophets closely resemble magical and shamanic practices. Elijah calling fire down from heaven, Elisha multiplying oil, and Moses performing miracles in Egypt. Were these events merely manifestations of divine power, or do they suggest a sophisticated form of theurgical magic practiced by the prophets? How far can we draw the line between prophecy and sorcery? In the ancient Near East, the role of the prophet was ambiguous and complex. The prophet did not merely deliver divine messages, but also acted as an intermediary between the human and the sacred. Often, the prophet would enter states of trance, receiving visions and revelations from a higher spiritual plane. But how were these altered states of consciousness induced? The use of herbs, music, and chants to achieve these trance states suggests that prophets might have employed shamanic techniques similar to those found in indigenous cultures worldwide. Could divine inspiration be closely linked to occult methods of altering the mind? The practice of invoking the Ruach HaKodesh, Holy Spirit, was central for many prophets, and it was believed that this spirit could confer supernatural powers and prophetic abilities. The idea that a spiritual force could descend upon a person and transform them into a channel for divine communication is a concept found in many esoteric and occult traditions. In Kabbalah, for instance, the Ruach is seen as a manifestation of the breath of God, a power that can be invoked through specific rituals and deep meditation. But did the prophets master this power, or were they merely passive instruments of a greater force? A compelling example is the supernatural duel between the prophet Elijah and the priests of Baal on Mount Carmel. Elijah challenges the priests to call upon the power of their God to ignite a fire, while he invokes Yahweh. When fire descends from heaven and consumes Elijah's offering, the event is described as a divine miracle. However, the use of invocations and rituals to manipulate fire suggests a form of elemental magic, aligning more with sorcery than traditional prophecy. This leads us to ask, to what extent were the prophets aware of the occult techniques they employed? Were these rituals a controlled way of channeling divine power? The idea of manipulating divine power is also evident in the stories of Moses. In the book of Exodus, Moses performs a series of miracles before Pharaoh, such as turning his staff into a serpent and turning the Nile's waters into blood. Curiously, the Egyptian magicians are able to replicate some of these feats, suggesting a shared understanding of certain magical methods. But if Moses was using similar practices to the Egyptian magicians, what set him apart? Was it the source of his power, which he attributed to Yahweh, or his intention, focused on liberating the people of Israel? The accounts of Elisha's miracles are also filled with events that could be interpreted as magical. Elisha is described as multiplying a widow's oil, reviving a child, and purifying a poisoned spring. In each case, we see the use of physical objects, such as oil and salt, manipulated in a ritualistic manner to produce a supernatural effect. This prompts us to question, were these miracles merely expressions of faith or examples of a sophisticated and hidden practice of spiritual alchemy? It is notable that, while many of these practices appear magical, they were accepted and even revered when performed by the prophets. The same was not true for those who performed similar rituals outside the prophetic context, such as diviners and sorcerers, who were condemned and persecuted. This reveals a tension between different forms of spiritual manipulation in ancient Israel. Was the distinction merely one of religious legitimacy, or was there a true difference in method and intention? In the Talmud, rabbis extensively discuss the differences between miracles and sorcery. Most agree that a miracle is a divine intervention, while sorcery is a human attempt to control the supernatural. However, in many cases, these distinctions are blurred. In the Sanhedrin tractate, for example, there is debate over what constitutes an act of sorcery and what is simply a miracle. This raises a fundamental question. How can we discern whether a supernatural act is divinely inspired or driven by a human desire for power? Esoteric traditions like Kabbalah offer a different perspective. Kabbalists believe that the prophets were aware of certain occult techniques and used this knowledge to access the Yesod, the deepest level of scriptural interpretation. These practices included specific meditations, the use of sacred letters, and combinations of divine names, seen as keys to unlocking portals of spiritual wisdom. Could this be a form of linguistic magic, where power lies in the precise manipulation of sacred words? Additionally, the belief that spoken words hold creative power is central in magic. In Kabbalistic texts, we find descriptions of how prophets could alter reality through their words, invoking Yahweh's power to manifest their intentions. This view echoes the Hermetic concept of the word is creator, an idea that later influenced Western occult traditions. So where does prophecy end and sorcery begin? Perhaps the answer lies in the prophet's own perception and the intention behind their acts. If the goal was to align with divine will and serve the greater good, the acts were seen as miracles. But if the intention was to manipulate the divine for personal gain, they were classified as sorcery. Yet, this distinction is subtle and often ambiguous, leaving room for interpretation and mystery. The prophets, with their visions and supernatural acts, walked a fine line between the sacred and the profane, between enlightenment and magic. And perhaps it is this ambiguity that makes them such fascinating and enigmatic figures even today. Could it be that, in seeking to uncover these hidden secrets, we are rediscovering an ancient form of spiritual knowledge deliberately concealed? Perhaps the techniques of the prophets hold the key to a forgotten practice of sacred magic that remains accessible to modern seekers. The story of the fallen angels is one of the most intriguing and dark narratives of ancient Israelite tradition, particularly in the context of apocryphal literature. The Book of Enoch, an esoteric work excluded from most biblical canons, offers a detailed account of how the Watchers, a group of rebellious angels, descended to earth, drawn by the beauty of the daughters of men. But what did these angels bring to the world? Forbidden knowledge, hidden secrets that were never meant to be revealed. Thus begins the genesis of grimoires, the first manuals of magic. These fallen angels, known as the Nephilim, taught humans various occult arts: astrology, sorcery, the creation of weapons, and even cosmetics, used to manipulate appearance and desire. The angel Azazel, in particular, is mentioned as the master of weapons and metals, revealing the art of forging and crafting blades. These skills granted power to humans, but also sowed the seeds of corruption and violence. Was this knowledge given as a gift or as a trap? Perhaps the fallen angels were preparing humanity for a spiritual rebellion against the divine order. Over time, This forbidden knowledge was recorded in texts later known as grimoires. Grimoires were not merely books of spells. They were true guides for manipulating the spiritual world, containing precise instructions for invoking and commanding spirits. One of the most famous of these texts is the Testament of Solomon, a manuscript describing how King Solomon, using a magical ring given to him by the archangel Michael, was able to control demons and force them to build the Temple of Jerusalem. But were these grimoires truly written by kings and prophets, or were they created by mystics and occultists seeking power? The Testament of Solomon offers a fascinating glimpse into a magical tradition that developed alongside official Judaism. In the text, Solomon not only invokes demons but interrogates them, learning their names, functions, and methods of influence over the human world. Each demon is described with a symbol or sigil representing its essence, which could be used to summon or banish it. These sigils became a central part of Solomonic magic and appear in countless medieval and Renaissance grimoires. But what makes these symbols so powerful? Are they merely drawings, or do they contain a spiritual code capable of opening portals to other dimensions? The practice of invoking and commanding spirits in the grimoires requires a deep understanding of sacred names and magical formulas. Many of the texts reference the Tetragrammaton, the four-letter name of God, YHWH, which is considered the key to accessing divine power. Magicians were instructed to pronounce the name with reverence and precision, believing that any mistake could result in disastrous consequences. This indicates that, even in magical practice, there was profound respect for the sacred power of divine names. But was this practice a legitimate form of theurgy, or was it seen as a daring attempt to control the uncontrollable? During the Middle Ages, Solomonic grimoires such as the Key of Solomon became reference manuals for European occultists. These texts were passed down in secrecy, often copied by hand by alchemists and magicians seeking to unlock the mysteries of the universe. The Key of Solomon contains detailed instructions for creating talismans, protective circles, and invocation rituals, all based on knowledge attributed to King Solomon. But why did Solomon, in particular, become the central figure of this tradition? The answer may lie in his reputation as Israel's wisest and most powerful king, someone who mastered both divine and occult knowledge. Grimoires also show an evolution in magical thinking, shifting from simple rituals to complex systems of invocation and control of entities. Texts like the Lemegeton describe complete hierarchies of demons, each with its own seal and office. Every spirit has a specific function and is summoned to perform precise tasks, from revealing hidden secrets to bringing wealth and love. This hierarchical system of demons reflects the human desire to understand and organize the spiritual world, an attempt to apply rational order to the unknown. But is this organization also a reflection of the struggle between order and chaos present in Israelite tradition? A common practice in the rituals described in grimoires is the use of magic circles for protection. The magician draws a circle on the ground, often adorned with divine names and sacred symbols, and stands inside it before invoking the entity. The circle is seen as a shield against the power of spirits, a barrier that prevents their influence. But why the circle? In sacred geometry, the circle represents wholeness and protection, a perfect shape symbolizing the infinite. The use of the circle in magical rituals can be interpreted as an attempt to replicate divine order in the material plane, shielding the practitioner from the spiritual chaos they are invoking. Grimoires also reference the use of sacrifices and offerings to appease the spirits. In some texts, the magician is instructed to offer wine, incense, and even blood to satisfy the summoned entity. This aspect of the rituals echoes the ancient sacrificial practices found in the Bible, where offerings were made to appease divine wrath or seek protection. Were these grimoires perpetuating an ancient form of worship suppressed by religious orthodoxy? Perhaps the magical tradition continued in the shadows, preserving rituals that date back to the earliest times. Despite their association with evil, many practitioners viewed Solomonic magic as a legitimate way to connect with the divine. For them, invoking angels and demons was a method of exploring the mysteries of the universe and gaining hidden wisdom. This view is reflected in esoteric texts, where the magician is depicted not as a wicked sorcerer but as a wise seeker of truth who challenges the limits of human knowledge. However, this practice always carried a risk: the danger of being consumed by the forces they sought to control. Grimoires, then, are more than mere books of magic. They are a legacy of esoteric knowledge, offering a glimpse into the occult practices that survived on the margins of institutional religion. They show us that the quest for spiritual power, whether through the invocation of angels or the control of demons, is an ancient tradition that continues to fascinate and terrify to this day. And they make us wonder, could it be that these ancient texts contain secrets that have yet to be fully understood? Perhaps the true power of the grimoires is still waiting to be rediscovered by today's seekers. Exploring the ancient spiritual and magical practices of the Israelites reveals a complex world where the line between the sacred and the profane was thin and often crossed. The stories of fallen angels, the secret rituals of the prophets, and the mysteries contained in the grimoires show us that hidden knowledge has always been part of the spiritual tradition, even if kept in the shadows and shared only with a select few. What was once considered taboo now fascinates us and makes us question the origins of our own beliefs and the nature of spiritual power. If you are interested in exploring more about spirituality, I have specially selected some videos full of profound insights and fascinating discoveries that you will love. Just click on one of them. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to continue this journey of self-discovery and spiritual learning. Your commitment to knowledge is the first step in transforming your reality.